Ahoy there, folks. I'm Captain Benzie, and welcome back to another Catskull Academy lesson for EVE Online. In this video, I'm going to be talking to you all about Breacher Pods, a new weapon system that was added a while ago for two of the new Deathless Circle ships, the Cenotaph and the Tholos. This is a really interesting and unique weapon system, and whilst I was researching how this worked on my recent return to the game, I found that a lot of people still didn't seem to understand exactly how they worked and what they did. In this lesson, we're going to cover everything you need to know about breacher pods, what they are, how they work, why you would want to use them in certain situations and perhaps not in others, and just dispel some of the myths and issues around this weapon system that some folks still seem to have. If you do enjoy this video, let me know. Hit like, drop a comment down below. You can drop a super thanks if you want to go the extra mile to help support. There are channel memberships as well that you can join in, get access to my videos a little bit earlier than other people would. I do have a Patreon page, but I'm currently redoing a lot of the things going on there, like the reward tiers, etc. So those are the ways that you can support me. If you are happening to shop on the EVE Online store at all, if you're buying Plex and things, you can add in my creator tag, CPT Benzie, at the checkout, and that will give me a small kickback as well. Finally, if you are new to EVE Online and enjoying these Catskull Academy videos, I have a link in the description that will give you 1 million free skill points. You don't need to be a new user, you just need to have not used one of those links before. Anyway, with all that said and done then, let's jump right in to talking about breacher pods, what they are, and how they work. First of all, I think it is vital that we talk about what a breacher pod launcher is in order to understand what this does and how it works. At the time of writing, breacher pod launchers come in small and medium varieties, and these can only be fitted, at the time of me making this video, to the Deathless Circle's Tholos class destroyer for the small breacher pod launcher, and the medium breacher pod launcher can only be fit to the Deathless Circle's Cenotaph class battle cruiser. Now, you saw the Cenotaph in the opening for this video. Last week I put out a video about the Tholos running Abyssal Dead Spaces. There will be more content coming for both of these ships because I really enjoy them. But for today, we're just going to be looking at the modules, the charges, and talking about those. So starting off then, the medium breacher pod launcher. Description: featuring a compact recloning vat that receives its clone's nanoheuristic mappings upon death, breacher pod launchers provide eligible ships the ability to send boarding parties rapidly into enemy ships via breacher pods. So that's what they do. It's worth noting that in order to use these, you are going to have to train up a few basic skills, Breacher Pod Launcher Operation 2, which requires, at its lower level, Information Psychology 1 and Missile Launcher Operation 3. As we go through this video, you will notice that breachers do use a lot of similarities with missiles. However, this is the only skill, missile-wise, that will actually do anything to your breacher pods. It is vital to note that things like missile projection or warhead upgrades are not going to benefit your breacher pods. You can be fully skilled into missiles, and breacher pods will not be affected by any of those skills. You just need Missile Launcher Operation 3 in order to be able to use Breacher Pod Launcher Operation 2, and thus medium breacher pod launchers. Now, at this point, I do want to just briefly look at the description for the charges as well. So here we have a Scarab Breacher Pod Medium. Scarab breacher pods are filled with Shrieker clones designed to board and wreak havoc in the vulnerable interiors of target ships, bypassing traditional damage resistances. And that's a very exciting end to the sentence there. It doesn't matter what what resistances your opponent's ship has. They can have massive amounts of shield or armor resistances. Breacher pods do not care. They use a very different damage calculation that ignores things like shield, armor, and hull resistances. So looking at the side here, all of these resistances I've got on the Cenotaph, if I were hit with a breacher pod, none of that matters. Anyway, let's go back to the launcher. It should also be noted that despite it being called a breacher pod launcher, it does not actually take up a launcher slot on a ship. The Cenotaph, for example, has 3 turret slots and 3 launcher slots. So I've got 3 missile launchers and 3 turrets fitted, and then the breacher pod launcher as well. But let's have a look at its attributes. Now, for its attributes here, we've got its charge size being medium. You can't use small breacher pods in a medium breacher pod launcher, and vice versa. You do need the correct charges for the correct size. We've got a reload time of 30 seconds. And interestingly enough, it should be noted that these do not auto-fire. When you normally activate, say, a group of turrets or missiles, they will fire, reload, and keep on going. These you have to manually fire every time, which, considering the cost of the charges, is actually beneficial, and considering how they work, more on that in a moment, again, you'll understand why that is a thing. At first, it can seem a little bit like, oh, that's quite annoying that I have to do that, but it does make sense. Now, its rate of fire is 10 seconds. That is with skills trained here. You can see I've got breach pod rapid firing. The base value is 20 seconds for these without training. So you can launch one, and then 20 seconds later, you can launch another one. If you do launch that other one, though, you're going to want to do so at a separate target. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. It uses one charge per cycle, so when you fire it, one Scarab breach pod is launched. Heat damage, again, is something that can be affected by thermodynamics. We're not going to talk too much about that. And we've got most of its stats here. So now if we go into the standard charge here, the Scarab Breacher Pod, and look at its attributes, we can talk about how this works. Again, it's a medium-sized charge, so it works with the medium Breacher Pod launcher. Makes sense, right? Then we have, like with missiles, maximum flight time and maximum velocity. Now, the maximum flight time of a Scarab Breacher Pod M is 4 seconds, and no skill changes this. Maximum velocity, on the other hand, at basis is 2,000 meters per second, but Breacher Pod projection skill, which we'll talk more later, does increase that velocity. Therefore, like with missiles, when you increase the velocity, it goes for longer. Basically, if you know it is going to be in space for 4 seconds and it travels at 2,000 meters per second, then it's going to move a total of 8,000 meters, right? Whereas if it's in space for 4 seconds at 3,000 meters per second, then suddenly that's going 12,000 meters. Hopefully that makes sense as to how that's calculated, but that essentially gives you the range, the maximum range of one of these launches. If we go down a little bit further, you'll see that you have like a base value of quantity there of how many charges can be loaded into it, and then these fun little bits here. So you'll notice that structure, thermal, explosive, and EM damage resistance are all set to 0, but we're not going to care about that. What we really want to talk about here is these bits here, these 3 stats. The damage effect duration, the maximum damage per second, and the maximum percentage of a target's hit points damaged per second. Now, first of all, the damage effect duration. This actually starts at 50 seconds, but training Breacher Pod clone longevity will increase how long this effect applies. Essentially, when you launch a Breacher clone, if it hits the target, i.e. if the target is in range, if the pod is launched and connects with the target before it is its fuel is spent and before it's been in space for 4 seconds, if it's within range and it connects, it applies a damage over time debuff to the target. That normally lasts for 50 seconds. You can, with Breacher Pod clone longevity, get that up to 1 minute 15 seconds here on the medium. It's worth noting that that rate of fire we saw earlier of 1 every 10 seconds means you don't want to be just firing at the same target. If you put a breacher pod onto a target, it will do damage for the next 1 minute 15 seconds. If you fire another one 10 seconds later, it will do damage for 1 minute 15 seconds, but you've overwritten the previous breacher pod debuff. So the best thing to do is to basically launch a breacher pod, let it do, in this case, 1 minute 5 seconds of damage, maybe 1 minute 10 seconds, then launch the next breacher pod so that that one connects and refreshes the debuff just before the first debuff drops off. Then we have the 2 stats here, maximum damage per second and maximum percentage of target HP. Now, I think a lot of people have focused on this bit and not necessarily had a look at the top bit in combination with it. Now, that 1% is, again, up from a 0.8% basis. That has been changed via skills, and Breacher Pod clone efficacy, again, increases the maximum damage per second. Now, if we were to look at this as a math situation, if we've got 1 minute and 15 seconds of duration, that is 75 seconds in total, 75 seconds times 1,000 damage per second is 75,000 damage that this will do over its lifetime, sort of. On the other hand, we have a 1% damage per second here, meaning this will essentially do 75% of the target's total EHP over its duration, depending on which of these two is the higher number. You see, if a ship had, for example, 30,000 hit points, then 1% of 30,000 is a whopping, well, put it this way, it's not to 1,000, it's 300. So if a target has 30,000 hit points, this will do a maximum of 300 damage on the 1% here, or 1,000 here. What the game will do is look at which of those two is the lower number and go for that one. So 1% of a target's hit points, in the case of a 30,000 DHP ship, is going to be 300 damage per second. And so that 300 damage times over the 75 seconds is 22,800. It's still a lot of damage, right? But it caps that way. What this means is I think a lot of people have looked at this and gone, oh my goodness, if you've got a breacher pod and you put it up against something like a structure with 3 billion hit points, the amount of damage that's doing is utterly insane. No, it's not. Because then at that point, if we were to look at, say, 3 billion, and we were to divide that by 1%, that gives us a total of 30 million, right? That 30 million is a lot more than 1,000. So you'd actually only do 1,000 damage per second for a total of 75,000 damage over the duration of the pod's lifespan. Hopefully that makes sense. You need to look at which of those two is going to be the lower number. It means that against massive ships with huge amounts of hit points, you're probably dealing a maximum of 800 to 1,000 hit points worth of damage per second, which is still a lot of damage in some cases. On the other hand, if it's against a smaller ship that doesn't have as much hit points, you may find that the 1% or the 0.8% is what becomes the cap instead. It will calculate those two values, figure out which one is the larger, and then apply that every single second for the entire duration, which will be anywhere between 50 seconds and 75 seconds, depending on your skills. So how do these actually work? Because we've talked about missiles. Well, essentially, they are like missiles. When you launch a breacher pod into space, it flies through space. If you have two stationary targets, we've done that calculation here, 4 seconds in space at 3,000 meters per second is 12 kilometers, 12,000 meters, right? That would give two stationary ships a maximum range of 12,000 meters. Now, if those two ships, if you were the breacher pod ship flying in a direction with the ship following you, you'll find that actually you can go a bit further than 12 kilometers because it's 12 kilometers from the point you launch to the point that it connects with the target ship. And if you launch it at point A whilst flying towards point B, and your opponent is flying towards point A, they're closing the gap between them and point A, thus reducing the actual total distance, right? It's like with missiles. I know it sometimes gets a bit confusing, but the other way to look at it is two ships at 12 kilometers apart. If I was chasing a ship that is 12 kilometers away, when I launch the breacher pod, it is 12 kilometers away from the point I'm 12 kilometers away from the point the enemy ship is at. But as the breacher pod travels towards the target, that target is not going to be in that same point anymore. It may have moved beyond it. Therefore, the full duration of the flight is expended the moment it reaches the position that the ship was in, not the position it is in. So you may need to be closer than your maximum range may otherwise specify. Very similar to missile mechanics, Eve University has some absolutely fantastic graphics that explain this better than you can sort of like verbally. Explaining it visually is better, so I'm going to see if I can get those graphics and have them on screen now to kind of explain that. Otherwise, it's just something worth looking into. In the in-game help files, they've got some excellent animations for that as well. But the range can be misleading due to how missiles work. But if it connects, that is how much damage it's doing, whichever of those two is the lower. Now, it's worth noting that a target can only have one breacher pod debuff on it at any time. If there are 5 of us flying cenotaphs and we all launch a medium breacher pod at a single target, if all 5 of us connect, it's whoever has the highest skilled one that will actually apply the damage over time. This means that if, for example, I'm fully skilled, here, you can see I've got the 1,000 HP rather than the 800 HP. I've got 3,000 meters per second rather than 2,000, so on and so forth. Essentially, if one of my friends puts a breacher pod on a target and then I fire mine, I will refresh the duration and it will use my stats. If, on the other hand, they then fire theirs, it will keep using my stats until that runs out. And then it will start using their stats. It will only ever allow one debuff to be applied at a time, which honestly, considering you can be doing up to 1% per second, so 75% damage over the duration of this thing's lifespan, having multiple of these on a target would be utterly insane, especially since it just ignores resistance. It deals flat damage. Can you imagine if you could put 3 of these on a target at once? 2 of them on a target, would be 150% of their EHP. They're basically guaranteed to die unless they can be repairing during that time, right? And they need to be repairing hard. So you can only have one breacher pod debuff active on a target at any time. Therefore, the best thing to do is to wait until it's just about to drop off, then reapply. Obviously, if you think your opponent is about to outrun you and that you're not going to be able to reapply it at a future date, yeah, get that breacher pod off. Breacher pods continue to do damage even when a ship is in warp and off grid. So if you launch these at someone and they don't realize until the last moment and they decide, oh, I'm going to warp off to safety, you may find they warp to their safe point and then explode when they get there because they take enough damage to wipe them out. That's kind of hilarious, I think, personally. I know there were some complaints about that when these were first announced and mentioned, but jumping through a Stargate does clear the debuff. So if you're hit with a breacher pod and you jump into a new system, then yes, you will lose the debuff at that point. It is worth noting, however, that you can have multiple debuffs active at once across multiple ships. Again, we saw the launcher earlier had a 10-second rate of fire, so considering these have a 75-second duration, if I had 5 enemy ships, I could launch a breacher pod at one of them, 10 seconds later launch at ship B, 10 seconds C, 10 seconds D, 10 seconds E, and they would all tick over for 75 seconds once they'd connected until I would need to refresh those. You can kind of think of these like curses and other damage over time debuffs in other MMOs, but the damage calculation, I think, is the important part. Anyway, hopefully that all makes a little bit of sense. Let's talk now about the skills. Breacher pod skills are found under the missiles category, but again, I need to state straight off the record here, most missile skills do not affect breacher pods. If you train things like warhead upgrades, for example, this is 2% bonus to all missile damage. That does not affect breacher pods. If you're looking at things like missile projection, which increases a 10% bonus to all missiles maximum velocity, that does not affect breacher pods. Breacher pods are only affected by breacher pod specific skills. It should be noted that, as we saw earlier, some of these, like breacher pod launcher operation, if I go into show info, this does have requirements of infomorph psychology and missile launcher operation 3. So you need to have missile launcher operation 3 in order to be able to train breacher pod launcher operation, but this skill and other missile skills do not affect the breacher pods. Even though missile launcher operation 3 gives a 2% bonus to missile launcher rate of fire, that does not affect the breacher pod. It is just a prerequisite. So when looking at breacher pods, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different skills. Starting off with breacher pod launcher operation, what this actually does, we can see here, is gives us a 5% increase to the maximum percentage of target HP damage per second per skill level. You saw earlier that the medium breacher pod would normally do 0.8%. This, by increasing that by 25%, takes it up to a total of 1%. That's how we got that. Now, the requirements we've already talked about, and you'll see that it does then give you need to have learnt this before you can go into breacher pod clone efficacy, and before you can use small breacher pod launchers and Scarab at level 1. Level 2 is what unlocks breacher pod projection and rapid firing, and the medium breacher pod launcher and the breacher pod M's themselves. At 3, that's when you can start training into breacher clone longevity. So for requirements, you only really need to train breacher pod launcher operation to 3. That said, that increased duration, I would get this to at least 4, because as with all skills in EVE Online, you get 80% of the skill's effect for 20% of the skill's total required skill points. Basically, getting a skill to level 4 gets you 80% of its effect, but at a cost of only 20% of the experience. That final effect, that final 20% of effect, is gated behind 80% of that skill's total experience requirement to get it to 5. So just remember that. Get it to at least 4, and that will give you a good start, and then it'll be 5 to train it up, obviously, if you do enjoy these things. So, sorry, I've just lost my train of where I was going to go with this. Efficacy is the next one we will then look at. So this is a specialist combat training of breacher pod clones, and it gives a 5% bonus to maximum damage per second cap per skill level. This is the flat number. You saw that the breacher pods earlier, again, I had them up to doing 1,000 DPS. They would have only been 8 100 DPS without that skill training. Training that skill increases the flat maximum damage, the one that is numbers, not percentages, the one that is actually, say, 1,000 damage or 700 damage or 200 damage or whatever it is for the different launches. This is the one that increases the flat bit. So you're looking to train basically operation and efficacy to increase the damage of the debuff. We then have longevity. Longevity, if we train into this, this gives us a 10% bonus to damage effect duration per skill level. That's how, again, I've gone from having a 50-second duration on my medium launches to having 75 seconds. It's that additional 50% for having this trained up all the way to level 5. Again, getting to level 4 is really nice because it means these debuffs last a long time. The longer they last, the more damage they do. Because if you're doing 1,000 DPS for 50 seconds, then that's 50,000 DPS. If you're doing 1,000 DPS for 75 seconds, that's 75,000 DPS. That is a big buff to the damage, but it is over time. Whereas the efficacy and operation are what are going to increase your base damage that you deal. Then we have Breacher Pod Projection. This is a 10% increase to Breacher Pod maximum velocity per skill level. That is range, flat out range. As I explained earlier, if you have a 2,000 meter per second launcher that launches for 4 seconds, then 2,000 times by 4 is 8,000 meters in total that it will travel. If you have 3,000 meters per second velocity over a 4-second duration, that's 3,000 times 4, which is then 12,000 meters traveled. This increases the range of your breacher pods and therefore makes it much easier to apply them onto a target just because you don't have to be as close. Finally, then, we have Breacher Pod Rapid Firing. This is a 10% reduction to Breacher Pod launcher cycle time per skill level. And for me, honestly, this is the least important of the Breacher Pod skills because if you're going up against one target, say for PvP, then you only need to launch the one Breacher Pod anyway. The fact that it cycles and then you can launch another one at a secondary target doesn't hugely matter if you've only got 1 or 2 targets. Yes, if you've got massive amounts of targets that you want to be putting breacher pods onto absolutely everyone, then training this up is going to help because it allows you to get those out quicker. But consider the fact that it's, for example, a 10-second reload on a 75-second debuff time. I don't want to be launching immediately most of the time. So just bear that in mind while you're putting your skills into your skill queue and deciding which order you want to put these in. Obviously, launcher operation, I would get up first. You want to get that at least high enough to start making the prerequisites for all of the others. So get that up to at least 3. Then I would start to train into things like efficacy, because efficacy is going to give you additional damage. I would look into projection, and I would look into clone longevity as your primary skills, and then train rapid firing up later on. Now, in order to use these, of course, you are going to need to have breacher pods as well. Whether those are Scarab breacher pod small or Scarab breacher pod medium will depend on the size of the launcher you're using. I'm not going to get into how you make these, where you get the blueprints. You can buy them off the market. You can buy them off a fellow industrialist. That's not the content I make. But those are the skills you're going to be needing here for the for breacher pod launches. Hopefully what I've done today is showcase how a breacher pod actually works and give you an idea of what these do and how to operate them. If you do have any questions, if you think I've missed anything, let me know in the comment section down below. Otherwise, thank you for watching. Thank you for your super thanks and your channel memberships and support. And again, if you do happen to buy anything on the EVE Online store, use my creator code CPTBenzi in the at the checkout, and that will give me a kickback as well. Thanks for watching, folks. Happy sailing, and see you in New Eden.